It was a night full of unexpected moments. The Smithsonian Gala in Washington, D.C. was one of those rare events where the world of politics and the world of celebrity collided. The grand hall sparkled under the soft glow of chandeliers, and the air was filled with the buzz of excited voices. Guests moved gracefully in their elegant outfits, tuxedos and gowns, the kind of attire you only wear when something special is happening. Laughter echoed in the space, mingling with the clinking of glasses as guests enjoyed their drinks and small talk. It was the kind of event that made you feel like you were a part of something bigger, something important. In the center of all this, Barack Obama stood, his usual calm presence a contrast to the excitement around him. He was deep in conversation with a small group of young entrepreneurs discussing their latest projects. He listened carefully, giving his attention to each one as they spoke. Though the atmosphere was lively, Obama's focus seemed sharp, like he was completely engaged with the conversation. Just as the group was beginning to laugh at one of the stories being told, a familiar voice interrupted. "Mind if I interrupt?" Donald Trump's voice cut through the noise, carrying easily over the chatter of the room. Obama turned, raising an eyebrow. He looked surprised but quickly recovered. He smiled, extending his hand in greeting. "Of course," Obama said, his tone polite but neutral. Trump, wearing his signature confident smile, shook Obama's hand firmly. The room around them seemed to quiet for a moment as guests turned their attention toward the two former presidents. It wasn't every day that you saw these two men in the same space, let alone in such a casual setting. But despite the attention, Obama remained composed, his smile never fading. "How have you been?" Obama asked, trying to make small talk. Trump nodded, talking briefly about his recent travels and business ventures. Their conversation, at first, was just the usual pleasantries, the kind of words you exchange when you're trying to keep things friendly without getting too personal. But as they spoke, something in the air changed. Trump leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. He said something that wasn't quite audible to anyone else in the room. His words were meant for Obama's ears only, the kind of thing you say when you want a private moment. Obama listened closely, his gaze steady. For a moment, he didn't say anything, just stared at Trump with a slight frown that lasted for only a fraction of a second. Then, without missing a beat, Obama gave a small laugh. "That's so," he replied, his voice light, as if the words didn't carry the weight they might have had with someone else. It wasn't clear what had been said, but the atmosphere around them shifted. The two men shared a brief but knowing look before Trump moved away, his attention already shifting to other guests. Obama, meanwhile, remained where he was for a moment longer. He stood silently, his gaze flickering back to Trump, who was now speaking to a different group across the room. Obama's smile was still in place, but there was something different in his eyes, something that suggested the conversation had left an impression. It wasn't a big moment, just a whisper in a crowded room, but for those who were paying attention, it felt like something more. Something was brewing behind the scenes, and it was clear that whatever had just happened between the two men was far from ordinary. The room hummed with the noise of conversations, glasses clinking and soft laughter as more guests arrived at the gala. It was the kind of event where everything seemed perfectly in place. Flawless tuxedos, sparkling gowns, and the kind of decor that made everything feel special. But amid all the glitz and glamour, one person stood quietly by the side, trying to blend in with the crowd. He was a reporter for the Washington Herald, a newspaper that prided itself on getting the story behind the story. That night, he had come to cover the event, to catch some quotes, and maybe write a piece on how the event was a symbol of unity and celebration. He had no idea that he would be witnessing something far more intriguing, something that would keep him thinking long after the evening ended. Standing near the corner of the room, the reporter adjusted the settings on his audio recorder. It wasn't unusual for him to need ambient noise for a piece like this, especially in a place like this gala. He wasn't aiming to overhear anything, but he knew that sometimes the best moments weren't always the ones you planned for. So, as he subtly shifted his position, he focused on capturing the background chatter, the soft hum of people in the room, the clinking of glasses, and the distant sounds of piano music playing from the stage. Then he noticed something. Donald Trump and Barack Obama were talking, standing close to one another. It wasn't just a quick hello or a greeting. There was something different about the way they were standing. the way their conversation had shifted. The reporter's ears perked up. He adjusted his recorder just a little bit, moving it ever so slightly in their direction. He didn't want to seem too obvious, but he also didn't want to miss a moment that could make for an interesting story. The next few seconds felt like they moved in slow motion. The two former presidents exchanged words, but the reporter couldn't catch everything. It wasn't until Trump leaned in closer to Obama, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, that the reporter realized he might be witnessing something significant. The conversation, now more private than before, wasn't meant for the ears of the room. The reporter held his breath, trying not to make any noise, praying that the recorder was picking up the words. Trump spoke quietly, so quietly that only Obama seemed to hear him clearly. The reporter caught only a few words, but they were enough to make his heart race. He couldn't be sure exactly what Trump had said, but it seemed important, almost like a secret. Obama, for his part, didn't seem overly shocked or upset. He simply listened, his face neutral, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. A quick shift that only someone paying close attention might have noticed. Then, after a brief moment, Obama responded with a light laugh, almost as if he found the comment amusing or surprising. Trump moved away soon after, his attention already drawn to someone else in the room. But the reporter couldn't shake the feeling that something had just happened, something that would make the evening a lot more memorable than he had expected. He couldn't wait to listen to the recording later, hoping that the words he had caught would reveal more than he had imagined. What had Trump said? What had Obama really thought about it? And why did it feel like something big was about to unfold? The reporter stood there, almost forgetting the event around him. The gala, the noise, the celebration, it all seemed far away now. All he could think about was the whisper and the mystery that was left hanging in the air. The reporter stood still for a moment, his eyes fixed on Obama and Trump, who were now separated by a few steps. The conversation had ended, but the strange feeling in the air lingered. The entire gala, with its elegant guests and sparkling chandeliers, seemed to fade into the background. Everything felt distant, as though the focus had shifted entirely to that brief exchange between the two former presidents. Trump, after whispering something to Obama, had turned and walked away, his attention already shifting to another group of people across the room. Obama, meanwhile, remained where he stood for a second longer, his gaze following Trump as he moved through the crowd. For a moment, Obama didn't say anything. He just stood there, holding his glass of wine, his expression thoughtful, as if the words Trump had whispered to him were still playing in his mind. It was only after a few moments that Obama finally rejoined his group of entrepreneurs. He slipped back into the conversation, his demeanor as calm and composed as ever. But the reporter could tell something had changed. There was a slight shift in Obama's tone, a subtle change in the way he responded to the others in the group. It was as if he had been pulled into a different world, even if only for a second. The reporter, meanwhile, was already replaying the audio in his mind. He hadn't caught all of Trump's words, but he knew enough to sense that whatever had been said was not a casual comment. The tone of Trump's voice had been low, almost secretive. It was the kind of thing that made you think twice about what had just happened. What was Trump trying to communicate? And why had Obama reacted the way he did? The reporter's curiosity grew stronger with each passing minute. He knew he needed to get a closer look at the recording. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to those few whispered words than he realized. He had to find out what had been said, but he also knew that he had to be careful. If he jumped to conclusions too quickly, he could miss something important. As the evening continued, the gala went on as planned. Speeches were made, guests mingled, and the music played softly in the background. But for the reporter, everything felt secondary to that quiet moment between Obama and Trump. The more he thought about it, the more questions he had. What had Trump meant by those words? Was it a simple remark, or was there something deeper going on? He kept replaying the scene in his mind. The way Trump had leaned in, the way Obama had listened without immediately responding. There had been a brief, almost imperceptible pause before Obama had laughed lightly, as if to brush off whatever had been said. But the reporter wasn't fooled. Something important had just happened, and he was determined to figure out what it was. As the night wore on, the reporter knew that the real story wasn't in the speeches or the celebrations happening around him. It was in that quiet, secretive moment between two powerful men. As the evening wore on, the gala continued in its grand fashion. Guests moved around the room, enjoying the food, the music, and the lively atmosphere. But the reporter, still standing near the corner, couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. His mind kept returning to that brief moment between Trump and Obama, the whisper, the reaction, and the strange, almost secretive air that had followed. The room around him seemed to move in slow motion, the chatter and laughter of the guests fading into the background. He wasn't paying attention to the speeches or the toasts being raised in celebration. His thoughts were fixed on that quiet exchange between the two former presidents. The brief but powerful interaction had left him with more questions than answers. What had Trump said to Obama, and why had Obama reacted the way he did? He glanced over at Obama, who was now engaged in another conversation, this time with a small group of philanthropists. Obama's smile was as warm and composed as always, but the reporter noticed a subtle shift in his body language. There was a certain distance in his posture, a slight tension that wasn't there before. The reporter wasn't sure if it was his imagination, but it seemed as though Obama's mind was still somewhere else, perhaps on that moment with Trump. The calm demeanor didn't fool him. There was something deeper at play. On the other side of the room, Trump was holding court with a group of business leaders, his voice booming as he laughed at something one of them said. He seemed completely at ease, but the reporter couldn't forget the way he had leaned in to whisper those few words to Obama. It was almost as if Trump had been planting a seed, leaving behind a thought that Obama couldn't easily shake off. As the reporter continued to observe, he began to wonder if there was more to the moment than just a passing comment. Had Trump been trying to test Obama, or was he revealing something important, something that no one else in the room could understand? The reporter wasn't sure, but he felt a growing sense of urgency. He had to figure it out. This could be the story that everyone would be talking about tomorrow, the one piece of the puzzle that no one had seen coming. He took out his phone and replayed the audio once again, carefully listening to the subtle shift in Trump's voice as he leaned in. The words were still unclear, but the tone, there was something about it. It wasn't a casual remark. It wasn't something you would say to just anyone. Whatever Trump had whispered, it seemed to have weight. It seemed to matter. The reporter knew that he couldn't leave the event without finding out more. He needed to ask the right questions to follow the right leads. But as he looked around the room, he realized that no one else seemed to notice the moment the way he did. Everyone else was too caught up in the glamour of the evening, too distracted by the usual conversations. No one else had heard what he had heard. He felt a sense of responsibility. This was his story to uncover. The night continued to unfold, and the atmosphere of the gala remained as lively as ever. Guests were caught up in the elegance of the event. Fancy dishes being served, glasses of champagne clinking, and laughter spilling across the room. But for the reporter, it felt as if the world had slowed down. The whisper that Donald Trump had shared with Barack Obama echoed in his mind, and he couldn't push it away. He had replayed the audio again and again, trying to catch more details. Trump's words were still unclear, but there was something about the way he spoke, something deliberate, that made the reporter even more curious. What had Trump meant by those words? And why had Obama reacted in such a calm yet thoughtful way? The more he thought about it, the more questions piled up in his mind. It wasn't just the whisper that bothered him. It was the way the entire moment felt different. Something important had happened between the two men, something that had slipped past most of the people in the room. The reporter's instinct told him that this wasn't just another typical encounter between political figures. No, this was something more, and if he didn't act quickly, he might never find out what. As the evening wore on, the reporter found himself drawn to the quiet corners of the room. He wasn't sure what he was hoping for, perhaps another conversation, another clue that could help him piece together what had really happened. He had already seen the way Obama had been slightly distracted after the whisper. Obama was talking with others, but his responses seemed to lack the usual energy. It was a small shift, but one that the reporter couldn't ignore. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story, something hidden beneath the surface of the gala's glamorous exterior. His thoughts raced, but he knew he needed to be careful. He couldn't just rush up to Obama or Trump and ask them directly about the conversation. That would raise suspicions, and it would be out of place in the midst of such an elegant event. Instead, he would need to be subtle to gather more information without drawing attention to himself. The reporter's eyes scanned the room, looking for anyone who might have noticed the same tension that he had. The problem was, no one else seemed to care. They were too caught up in their own conversations, too absorbed in the excitement of the evening. There were no whispers or curious looks, just the ordinary bustle of a gala. He felt a twinge of frustration. This was the kind of story that could change everything, yet no one else seemed to notice what he had overheard. The reporter's instincts told him that the key to the whole mystery lay in those few words between Trump and Obama. If he could just figure out what had been said, it might unlock everything. As the night came to an end, the reporter knew he had to act. He couldn't let this moment slip away. He needed answers, and he was determined to find them, no matter how long it took. Something big had just happened, and he was going to be the one to uncover it. The days that followed the gala were filled with a quiet kind of tension. The reporter couldn't stop thinking about that moment between Donald Trump and Barack Obama. He had played the audio again and again, trying to catch every word, but the whisper was still unclear. It was driving him crazy. What had Trump said to Obama? And why had Obama reacted the way he did? The more the reporter thought about it, the more questions piled up. He had hoped that maybe someone else had noticed what had happened, that maybe other people had caught the same sense of mystery that he had. But when he reached out to colleagues, they all brushed it off. Just another moment at a gala, they said. Nothing to see here. That only made the reporter more determined. He knew something important had happened. He just had to figure out what. He began to dig deeper, reaching out to people who had been at the event. He asked them if they had noticed anything strange between the two former presidents. But most people seemed too focused on the event itself, too caught up in the festivities to pay attention to what was going on between Trump and Obama. The more the reporter tried to find answers, the more it felt like he was chasing shadows. It seemed as if no one else cared about that brief moment, as if it had already been forgotten. But the reporter couldn't forget. There was something in that whisper, something in the way Trump had spoken to Obama that felt significant. It wasn't just a casual remark. The reporter could feel it in his gut. He knew that there was something important hiding behind that brief exchange. He just had to find the right person to talk to, someone who could shed light on what had really happened. One day, while doing research on a completely different story, the reporter came across a brief mention of a private conversation between Trump and Obama at the gala. It wasn't much, just a short line in a news article, but it made the reporter's heart race. It was the first real clue he had found in days. The article hinted that there was more to the conversation than what had been visible on the surface. It mentioned that both men had been seen discussing something quietly, and that their exchange had left an impression on those who were nearby. The reporter felt a sense of hope rise within him. Maybe, just maybe, he was onto something. He wasn't sure what the conversation had been about, but now he had a lead. It wasn't much, but it was more than he had before. The more he thought about it, the more it made sense. There was no way that moment had been a random exchange. Something had been said, something that could have consequences. He knew it wasn't going to be easy to get the full story, but he was determined. The reporter wasn't going to let this slip away. Something big had happened, and he wasn't going to stop until he figured out what it was. The mystery of that whispered conversation had become an obsession, and he was going to see it through to the end. The following week, the reporter found himself at his desk, staring at his computer screen. The lead he had found, the brief mention of a private conversation between Trump and Obama at the gala, kept playing over and over in his mind. He had spent days trying to get more details, reaching out to sources, reading through old interviews, and sifting through reports. But despite his efforts, he still didn't have the full picture. He could feel the pressure building. He was so close, yet the answers seemed just out of reach. He took a deep breath, reminding himself that persistence was key. He had made progress, and he couldn't stop now. This could be the story of the year, the one that everyone would remember. But he needed more. He needed to get to the heart of the conversation that had left such a strange feeling in the air that night. His phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello," he said, his voice steady but with a hint of curiosity. Is this the reporter who was at the gala? A voice on the other end asked. It was a woman's voice, calm and collected, but there was something about it that made him sit up straighter. She continued, I heard you've been asking about Trump and Obama's conversation. His heart skipped a beat. Yes, that's right, he replied. Do you know something about it? The woman paused for a moment, as if deciding how much to say. I was there, she said finally. I'd overheard part of what they said. It's not much, but it's enough that I think you should know. The reporter's pulse quickened. This was it. This could be the breakthrough he had been waiting for. He leaned forward, eager to listen. Please, tell me what you heard. The woman explained that she had been close enough to catch some of the words spoken between the two men. She didn't hear the entire conversation, but she was certain that it had been more than just small talk. What struck her the most was the way Trump had spoken to Obama. There was a certain weight to his words. She couldn't make out everything, but she was sure that whatever had been said had an underlying purpose. The way Obama had responded, calm, collected, but with a slight shift in his expression, told her that something important had been discussed. Do you have any idea what it was about? The reporter asked, his voice filled with anticipation. I'm not entirely sure, she said slowly, but it sounded like they were talking about something beyond politics. It felt personal, like they were discussing something that only they could understand. The reporter took a deep breath. This was more than he had hoped for. It wasn't a complete answer, but it was the closest he had gotten. He thanked the woman for sharing the information and promised to keep her identity confidential. As the call ended, the reporter sat back in his chair, letting the words sink in. He still didn't know exactly what had been said, but he now had a deeper understanding of the significance of the moment. The conversation had been more than a passing exchange. It was a moment of connection, one that might hold the key to understanding the bigger picture. It wasn't just about what had been whispered, it was about what was left unsaid and what it meant for both men and for the world. The reporter felt a surge of excitement. He was on the right track now. The story wasn't over yet, but it was closer than ever, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. The reporter sat quietly at a small table in a quiet cafe, watching the city move outside the window. People passed by, unaware of the puzzle he had been trying to solve for days. His notebook lay open in front of him, filled with notes, questions, and thoughts about the moment between Donald Trump and Barack Obama. He had spoken to witnesses, studied the footage, listened to the audio over and over, and even taken a call from someone who had overheard part of the exchange. Yet the full truth still remained just out of reach. But something had changed. Even without knowing the exact words Trump had whispered, the reporter had come to understand something deeper. The moment wasn't about power or politics in the usual way. It was about something personal, something shared between two men who had once stood in the same office, carried the same responsibilities, and faced the same pressures. He remembered how Obama had stood still after the whisper, not shaken, but clearly thoughtful. And he remembered how Trump had walked away without looking back, as if he had said what he needed to say. It was a moment that didn't fit neatly into headlines, and maybe that was why no one else had paid much attention. But the reporter knew better. It wasn't always the loudest moments that mattered. Sometimes it was the quiet ones. He thought about how the woman on the phone had described the exchange. She hadn't heard the whole thing, but she had felt the same shift in the air. It was a reminder that sometimes people don't need full sentences to understand that something meaningful has happened. Tone, timing, and silence could tell just as much as words. The reporter took a slow sip of his coffee, then began typing on his laptop. He decided not to focus only on what was said, but on what the moment meant. He wrote about the feeling in the room, the look in Obama's eyes, the weight in Trump's voice. He described how, in a room full of noise and celebration, a whisper had left the strongest impression. He added a short line in the middle of the piece. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe for more real moments like this one. It was a simple reminder, placed gently between the paragraphs, not too loud, not too forced. As he finished the article, he didn't claim to know all the answers. Instead, he focused on the truth he had discovered. Some moments are more powerful than facts alone. They leave questions, stir curiosity, and make people wonder. And sometimes, that's enough to make a story worth telling. The reporter closed his laptop, feeling a quiet sense of closure. He hadn't solved every part of the mystery, but he had captured what mattered most. The whisper between two former presidents would remain a small mystery in history. But now it would also be remembered, and he had been the one to tell it.